From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Negotiations to end the war in Ukraine begin in Riyadh, and Ukraine has no seat at the table. We'll have the latest on the talks between Russia and the U.S. with analysis from former State Department official Mara Rudman.
President Trump floats a 25% tariff rate on autos, chips, and pharma, and fields questions on the DOGE and Elon Musk amid pushback from Democrats and unions on the efficiency effort. We'll have more with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida.
And Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York also joins this hour as his state's Governor Kathy Hochul meets with New York City leaders on the future of Mayor Eric Adams. Thanks for being with us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power, the late edition. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we spent the day, Kaylee, balancing domestic stories in terms of New York City's mayor and, of course, geopolitical ones with an important meeting today in Riyadh.
Yeah, and one that Donald Trump spoke about at Mar-a-Lago when he was taking questions from press earlier on the suggestion that Ukraine did not have a seat at the table in Riyadh today. He suggested this has been happening for 3 years. Yeah. And if they wanted to make a deal, they could have earlier.
Well, at the table, speaking on behalf of the administration, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he spoke alongside President Trump's Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war. When you talk about an enduring and sustainable end to the conflict, it means one that's acceptable to everyone involved in it. And that obviously includes Ukraine, but also our partners in Europe and, of course, the Russian side as well.
Joining us now for the latest is Bloomberg's national security team leader, Nick Wadhams, here in Washington. So, Nick, obviously, Marco Rubio did say Ukraine and Europe would be brought into these conversations eventually. But right now, it does seem U.S. and Russia are the ones taking the lead here. And President Trump just said he thinks he will meet with Vladimir Putin by the end of the month.
Well, no secret that he wants to meet with President Putin very quickly, though obviously there's a lot of work that needs to happen before now and then. The big issue is going to be what they actually discuss in that meeting. Is that a meeting where he would essentially want to put a bow on some sort of a deal? Seems very, very unlikely that the U.S. would be able to get to something like that before the end of the month. So a lot of wait and see. But I think, given how the president has frequently promised things that end up getting pushed back by weeks or even months, it's going to be tough to get that done before the end of February.
Of course, the purpose of this meeting may simply to get to the next meeting, Nick, and we've seen that scenario before. We talked on the early edition of Balance of Power with Jennifer Kavanaugh of Defense Priorities, what she had to say about the outcome of this session.
The key outcome was the appointing high-level negotiating teams to work through those issues. So no decisions about Ukraine were made without Ukraine. Anyone who's working in the Trump administration who really does want a lasting peace would also want Ukraine at the table. Research shows that no peace settlements that are imposed on countries that are forced to sign rarely endure. So if the goal here is to have a lasting peace, which it seems like it is, then Ukraine will have to be at the table.
Certainly spooked our European allies. Nick, an emergency meeting on Saturday, another one now reportedly set for Wednesday. What do they make of this?
Well, I mean, the big question is in part optics. I mean, you heard the president say just there, listen, you had 3 years to get this done and you haven't been able to do it, in some ways faulting Vladimir Zelenskiy on that issue. But, of course, the big point that the former administration, the Biden administration, maintained was, we wanted peace. It was President Putin who didn't want to come to the table. And indeed, the assessment was that Russia just was continuing to make gains, though it has lost so many hundreds of thousands of troops. The feeling was that they continue to take territory and they believe they could grind down Ukraine and essentially fracture Allied support. Now, there is some indication that that's exactly what's happening. You see the U.S. distancing itself from Europe. So a real push on the European side to try to find more financial wherewithal to help Ukraine. How that shakes out, though, of course, anybody's guess.
Well, that's for sure. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams. Thank you so much, Nick, for the update. Earlier this hour, as mentioned, President Trump signed additional executive orders focused on making IVF more available and affordable, and others requiring transparency by federal agencies. He also suggested, while talking with reporters, auto tariffs threatened for April 2nd could come in around 25%. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg White House reporter Skylar Woodhouse. Skylar, it's great to have you back. This all happened from Mar-a-Lago. I don't know how much news we really expected to come out of the president today, but he does seem intent on sticking with this April 2nd deadline for auto tariffs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, tariffs have been the talk of town under President Trump, and he's just been really leaning into executing these tariffs, as he said he would do on the campaign trail, everywhere from what he did say was going to come for Canada and Mexico that then got delayed, and he suggested tariffs for China, the EU, and now we're the reciprocal tariffs, and now we're at the auto tariffs. Yeah. So this is the latest in the tariff saga, one could say.
Well, and we've got a lot of sagas that we're tracking. There's the tariff saga. There is the government reduction saga that's being led by Elon Musk, even though the White House is saying today he is not an employee of the Department of Government Efficiency, but he worked his way into Donald Trump's de facto press conference as well, as he talked about this notion that he wouldn't let there be conflicts of interest for Elon Musk, including not anything to do with space. Yet we understood that DOGE was taking a look at NASA. Where are we at with this, Skylar?
Well, President Trump, during his press conference at Mar-a-Lago, also called Elon Musk a patriot and said you could call him whatever you'd like. So it's no secret that the president and Elon Musk are quite cozy and are pretty, presented as very good friends from the campaign trail to now with Trump in the Oval Office. And, so this is just a story that I think many are still trying to understand and to really figure out. Well, if you say this, then what does this actually mean in terms of, how are we executing, what it is that he is doing with DOGE? And so there's a lot of questions that so many people are trying to understand and figure out.
Including, is the DOGE Elon Musk? To your point, It's been widely reported they arrived on site at NASA on Thursday, but maybe Elon Musk himself will be removed from that consultation, according to the president. We'll see.
Yeah, I guess maybe we could get more answers in that joint interview they're doing on Fox News today. Bloomberg, Skylar Woodhouse, thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll take a look at Democrats' strategy to fight back against the Trump administration's DOGE efforts with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. She's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
These individuals are political appointees at the respective agencies, and any cuts, any firings, any hirings are at the discretion of the secretaries of these agencies. They are all cooperating with DOGE's efforts to cut federal government waste, fraud, and abuse.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today on DOGE audits and layoffs happening throughout the federal government. And a federal judge in Washington earlier this afternoon denied a request to temporarily block Elon Musk and the efficiency team from accessing internal systems and removing employees at multiple U.S. agencies. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, also former chair of the DNC. Congresswoman, to this point, we have seen the courts acting as the mechanism for pushback against what the DOGE is trying to do. But if they aren't going to be able to push back fully, what can your party do to check this?
Well, really, Kelly, thank you so much for having me once again. Let's be very clear. It takes 3 House Republicans to stop Elon Musk and his DOGE bags from rummaging through millions of Americans' personal information when it comes to their IRS records, their Social Security numbers, their financial information, their most significant personal information. Elon Musk's DOGE drones are rummaging through all of that information and have unchecked power to do whatever they want. They're indiscriminately firing people, and what Caroline Leavitt just said on your clip there is absolutely not true. They are randomly firing people who are not political employees. They're firing probationary employees, and they're doing so in violation of the law, specifically because many of these people have gotten glowing reviews based on their performance, and they are actually prohibited from dismissing people for things other than performance-related questions. So they are violating the law, and most importantly, they are gravely harming the quality of life and the health of so many people, particularly our veterans, where they just fired over 1,000 people at the VA, all while the VA is struggling with a dearth of employees and really need to make sure that they have the staffing that they need to implement the PACT Act, which Congress passed just a couple of years ago.
They're calling it the Valentine's Day Massacre, the thousands of probationary employees who were laid off, in many cases by voicemail and email over the weekend. Congresswoman, we saw a number of tenured employees fired as well, resulting in the top official at the Social Security Administration to step down. Also stepping down over the weekend, Jim Jones, head of the food division at the FDA. He issued a statement. This is, by the way, the same person who moved to ban red dye number 3 earlier this year. Issued a statement saying, given the new administration's disdain for the very people needed to make these changes, it would be fruitless for me to continue in this role. To what extent, if any, are we going to see interruptions in government services?
We're going to see further interruptions at the VA in particular nearly immediately. Like I said, we already have a shortage of employees and a $6 billion shortfall that the VA just let Congress know that we need to fill in order to make sure that we can provide the services that the law requires, the health care that is vital for these toxic, exposed veterans who served in battles all over the world and were exposed to vicious toxins that are making them sick. And now Trump and Musk come in and take a hatchet to the ability for us to provide those services to our veterans. So many of those, Joe, are veterans themselves. A third of the employees in the federal government are veterans. So just when we have an opportunity to make sure that we are taking care of those that defended themselves, that helped defend our country, Donald Trump and Elon Musk and his cronies are indiscriminately firing people. They're requiring spouses of active duty military to come back to the office. I'm all for people coming to work. But when you have a military spouse who is able to work remotely for the federal government so she can be with her children and her spouse in where they're deployed rather than, at the federal agency office in Washington, that's how we take care of our people. And Donald Trump is not only not taking care of our people, but he's denying them health care. He's going in and making it harder for people to get Social Security benefits. And he's allowing DOGE to rummage through people's personal information. To what end? It is very disturbing that that kind of personal information for millions of Americans is being allowed to be accessed by nameless, faceless DOGE employees with no understanding of what they're planning to do with that information.
Well, Congresswoman, I'd like to ask you about something else for when you return to Washington, given that you sit on the Appropriations Committee. We're now less than a month out from the deadline to keep the government funded. Do you have an understanding of what the plan is to avoid that?
The ball, Kaylee, is in the Republicans' court. We have a March 14th deadline. That's about 3 weeks from now. And we don't have an agreement on the top line funding amount. The Speaker has said something about kicking the can down the road and doing a full year CR, which would jeopardize our national security. That's hugely damaging to the Department of Defense funding that's so vital. It makes it difficult for us to make sure that we can fund the healthcare needs of the American people. The Republicans need to come to the table and they need to sit down across the aisle. If they leave this to appropriators, we're going to be able to get this done because that's our expertise. We know how to sort things out. But the Republicans, or 3 of them, need to come to the table and sort this out so that we can pass a full year budget and make sure that we can take care of the American people and move on to the FY26 budget, which we're supposed to be starting imminently.
All right, she's looking for 3 Republicans. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Democrat from Florida, we thank you, as always, Congresswoman, for the insights. Coming up, New York Governor Kathy Hochul, as we told you, meeting with New York City leaders today to discuss the future of Mayor Eric Adams, whether he should keep his job. We'll have more ahead with Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We've had our eyes on New York today, where Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul met with key leaders to discuss the future of New York City's mayor, Eric Adams. This comes as 4 of Adams' top deputies resigned from their positions on Monday. In a statement, the governor said, quote, "If they feel unable to serve in City Hall at this time, that raises serious questions about the long-term future of this mayoral administration," unquote. Governor Hochul does have the legal authority to remove the mayor. A lot of people learning this today for the first time. It's never been used before. Expected to hold off a decision until after a federal court hearing Wednesday on the Justice Department's bid to formally drop the bribery charges against Adams. As we prepare to talk with Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, Kaylee, this talk of a quid pro quo brings us back to this interview on Fox on Friday, in which Eric Adams sat next to Tom Homan, and they talked about, kind of laughing about this deal that had been struck to help the administration rid New York City of illegal migrants. A lot of questions about what they meant.
Yeah, and what their body language and facial expressions were signaling during that joint interview, especially on the part of Mayor Adams, keeping in mind that this has really reignited what had previously been a wave of calls for his resignation in the aftermath of when he was initially indicted back in fall, in late September. Kathy Hochul obviously did not make a move to get Adams out of this job at that time, but it does feel like the winds may have changed here in the aftermath of this move at the DOJ. And the question, of course, becomes what kind of vacuum that would leave in New York City for a moment. Keeping in mind, Kathy Hochul herself, as governor, is going to be in a re-election fight here in pretty short order, including with our next guest, Mike Lawler, a Republican, who is considering at least a run against her. Is the congressman with us now? We're going to bring Mike Lawler in from New York, I think by phone, for our conversation. Congressman, are you with us? Can you hear us? Mike Lawler? I think we're still waiting on that connection. But, of course, we're still also waiting on his decision as for whether or not he will, in fact, be running for governor or run for his seat in the House once again. He actually just received a Democratic challenger for the seat in his district today. So certainly there are all sorts of politics to navigate here, keeping in mind as well the issues in New York City specifically. A lot of the politics center around issues like immigration, bringing us back to the efforts of ICE and deportations in cities like New York. And we should note, by the way, that Mayor Eric Adams says he's going nowhere. He did speak publicly yesterday, referred to Mein Kampf. He said, that's what you're seeing right now, a modern-day Mein Kampf. So this is something that we'll keep tabs on, and I hope that we can connect with Congressman Lawler as soon as possible. We were referring earlier to the DOGE, Kaylee, and the fact that they showed up at the doorstep of NASA in the past couple of days. Potential cuts could have serious implications, of course, for the country's space ambitions, or at least where we're directing our priorities here. A discussion we had earlier today with Keith Cowing, editor at NASA Watch, former NASA employee, joined us here on Bloomberg.
Start laying off civil servants. You're going to cut your budget a little bit, but not a whole bunch, because it's really not the biggest part of the federal budget. But the knee-jerk reaction is at NASA, oh, well, we'll just get contractors to do that work. Well, you know, you can just fire them with a nasty look. You don't even have to go through any procedures other than what's in the contract. And so ask yourself, you put this with, oh, we want to go to Mars by 2025, 8, whatever. You're going to do that with less people? You know, if it was a private sector company, you might get away with that. But this is a government agency with government contracts, and it's probably going to take them 2 or 3 years to figure out what's left, much less not be able to do a sprint thing to Mars and to the moon and to build a new space station and all the other things that NASA does.
Well, and who runs the biggest space contractor in the world, Keith?
Right now, apparently it's SpaceX with Elon Musk. But, you know, I think people would ask me, about this. I don't agree necessarily with his political science, but I do like his rocket science. And his company has a lot of people there that they're just there to build rocket ships and explore the universe. So you got to kind of parse the personalities here. But at the end of the day, it's the White House. Elections have consequences. It's the people in the news with the names. And it's going against the government as a whole. Again, poor little NASA just happens to be a little more vulnerable because you can't just take too many pieces out of the rocket ship because it'll blow up.
Wow. So on January 31st, Keith, NASA paused all activities of advisory organizations inside the agency. And you can talk about these are scientific groups. They focus on planetary science and more esoteric fields. The first group affected the Mercury Exploration Assessment Group. They're supposed to gather on the 4th of February for a couple of days of talks here and meetings about some of the planning that they were doing here. 60 people set to show up at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Research Lab in suburban Washington. This is according to the Washington Post. After the DEI orders went out from the agency, they canceled one topic, I guess, that was talking about DEI and trying to lift up some communities who didn't have access to a lot of science training. And they thought the meeting was compliant. On January 31st, NASA forced them to cancel the entire thing. This is happening across different groups in the agency. What does it mean for scientific research, for innovation, and what actually people want to get out of NASA?
Well, nothing good. And of course, again, with NASA, there's other space agencies, but I just tweeted something. This is I worked there. It's the most amazing group of people. Need to collaborate with each other and talk. And then they've touched the sun. They've gone to every planet, and we're in interstellar space now. You just don't sit down and do that. You have to work with these groups, and these advisory committees are usually sanity checks, like the program manager sits down and says, hey, I want to point the telescope here, or there. And they say, you know what, you should do this, you should do that. Yeah, we think it's good. And it's just a sanity check, but it's also, those people are also being paid to do the science. So when you stop doing these meetings, they're not just, if they said, hey, we're going to go to Zoom, I think, all right, maybe they're going to save some travel funds. No, they're not doing any of these meetings at all. And when it comes to the DEI thing, again, you can go wherever you are on that position. But NASA has always, as an agency, tried to be as inclusive of everybody everywhere, even when I was a little kid in the 60s. And so, if you're overzealous with, oh, that looks like a word, I can't use it, you just slice things off. And that's what's happening.
That was Keith Cowing, editor at NASA Watch, on the early edition of Balance of Power today. And we have more coming up on this late edition straight ahead with former State Department official Mara Rudman, who will weigh in on the talks that began today in Saudi Arabia between the U.S. and Russia on ending the war in Ukraine. Ukraine and Europe, of course, not having a seat at the negotiating table today. And we'll have her weigh in on that next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Any negotiation is going to take a lot of rounds of talks, and it makes sense that the United States and Russia would start by dealing with some of their bilateral issues. That does not mean that Ukraine should be excluded for all the rounds of talks, but certainly the United States and Russia have a long history of tense and difficult relationships, and there are a lot of bilateral issues that the two countries need to work out before they even sit down at the table with the other parties.
Jennifer Kavanaugh of Defense Priorities talking with us today on the early edition of Balance of Power about the meetings that took place today between the U.S. and Russia when it comes to Ukraine. Joining us now for a closer look at the significance of today's talks throughout Europe and back here in Washington is Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, former special envoy for Middle East peace at the State Department. Mara, it's great to have you, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Much was said today about who was not at the table, including Ukraine and all of our European partners. Is there a case, though, to be made, as the Trump administration has, for efficiency, getting through these early stages so negotiating teams can be named and then additional players are brought in? Or is this simply the world according to Trump and Putin?
I think, sadly, this is the world according to Trump and Putin. Jennifer Kavanaugh, who you had on, you played a clip, I think was putting the best possible spin on what I think is a deeply unfortunate situation. And the phrase, frankly, lipstick on a pig comes to mind in terms of what she was trying to argue about a way of negotiating that most effectively protects United States interests and United States security, which is, of course, the core job of the President of the United States. This is not that.
Well, we heard from the President of the United States speaking at Mar-a-Lago in the last hour, Mara, and he was asked about Ukraine's disappointment that they were not included in these talks today. And he suggested he was disappointed to hear that they were upset and went on to say they've had a seat at the table for 3 years. You could have made a deal, suggesting that perhaps something could have been done with territory early on in this conflict. What does that signal to you about the role Ukraine realistically can expect to play in any negotiation?
Well, it signals to me that President Trump is not interested in a negotiated outcome. He's interested in doing what he has been doing within the United States, which is ignoring basically how you get to sustainable solutions and acting as a wrecker, I would say a destroyer. It's much easier to destroy relationships, to destroy sovereignty, unfortunately to attack, in the case of the United States, our Constitution, than it is to build and to negotiate. And those things take more time, they take more care, and they take the ability to actually listen to people with whom you may disagree to get to lasting solutions.
There was an emergency meeting, as it was referred to, in France on Saturday. It looks like there'll be another on Wednesday as European leaders try to figure out their own approach to this. Much of the talk, though, was over sending in peacekeeping troops, in fact, if there is a deal. Will European nations still make good on any promises to send troops if they're not actually at the negotiating table?
So what I imagine at this point is that the leaders of countries across Europe are trying to figure out how to best protect and defend the security of their own countries. And what they had assumed believed for decades was a strong transatlantic partnership, they see, at least under this current presidency, disintegrating around them. And so they are trying to figure out the concern about Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was not only about Ukraine, but about what it signaled for Russia's intentions across Europe. It's the reason for NATO. President Trump has not been a big supporter of NATO either. And so I think you have a number of European countries trying to figure out if it's in their interest to be able to, and how they, if so, how they go ahead and provide peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine. Again, it's to help Ukraine, but it's really to keep Russia from going further and exposing the rest of Europe. But the European resources to do that are a challenge, particularly if they don't have the backing or the backup support of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially when you consider that European leaders are facing domestic challenges of their own. You just need to look at Olaf Scholz in Germany, for example, to see evidence of that, as we're focusing on particularly this week. But when we think about the domestic political picture in countries like Ukraine, and this is something the president also was talking about at Mar-a-Lago, suggesting that Vladimir Zelenskiy is deeply unpopular when asked about calls for a new election. Is Zelenskiy going to be able to remain the leader of Ukraine when all is said and done?
That will be a choice for the people of Ukraine to make. It is difficult to lead a country through the kinds of conflict, the kinds of costs that Ukraine has faced over the last few years. And particularly if he's in the position of having to do so without the backing of the United States. I would say one of many things that concerns me deeply about how the national security interests of this administration, I believe President Trump and his team, are being disregarded, is the extent to which they are cavalier about interfering with the politics of other countries, which is actually against provisions of U.S. law to interfere in other countries' politics and elections. And yet in the comments that President Trump made about Ukraine, and the comments that Vice President Vance made when he was in Germany, and at the Munich conference just recently, and in fact, not meeting with the sitting chancellor of the country, but meeting with far-right extremist neo-Nazi groups, and what Elon Musk has been saying and doing on social media, all of these actions are not only deeply anti-democratic, but do not, as I see it, safeguard at all the security interests of the United States and blatantly ignore the laws we have in place, and the laws we have in place for a reason about not interfering with foreign politics and elections.
So, Mara, should Ukraine start getting used to its borders where they currently lie?
It's not at all clear to me where these negotiations with Russia that, again, have not included Ukraine when it's about the territory and the sovereignty of Ukraine. These are thus far discussions between the United States and Russia. It's not clear to me what Russia is willing, where they're willing to stop and at what borders. And it's also unclear to me that Ukraine is just going to back off because President Trump tells them they must. I think this is part of what other countries in Europe are also calculating, because it's in their interest to keep Russia at bay. And Ukraine has been doing that. And so there are a lot of complicated questions on the table, and it's not as simple as anything President Trump may say in terms of what he and Vladimir Putin decide in how the rest of Europe should be carved up. That's actually not how it works in reality.
All right, Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and former State Department official, thank you so much. And as we're talking here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, we just got some fresh news out of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who says the U.S. will not lift sanctions on Russia before a deal is made on Ukraine. That, of course, entered into the conversation after the talks in Riyadh today, Joe, as they also talked about deepening an economic relationship between the U.S. and Russia when all is said and done.
Could be more comprehensive talks at some point, but clearly trying to push back on this idea of giving Russia a leg up here or losing some sort of leverage just by sitting down at that table today, Kayleigh. And
we want to get more now around our table, both in Washington, D.C. and New York, and turn to our signature political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors joining us, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Democratic strategist and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Rick, as we discuss what the actual shape of a deal could look like here, do you believe it matters to President Trump what the deal looks like as much as he's the one that gets to make it?
Well, he is the one who gets to make this deal. I think that's now settled fact. But I think he has a point of view of what he wants to be able to do. I think that it follows pretty traditional U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine. It's just, I think everyone's getting caught up in the form over the substance. I don't think the substance isn't that much debate, but the form is Donald Trump. He's the negotiator. He is the negotiator. There's no table. There's no kids' table. There's no adults' table. It's the Donald Trump table. And wherever he goes and whatever he does, he believes all the negotiations, Europe, Russia, Ukraine, any other players in this, all have to respond to his ups and downs. And so I think everyone needs to take a step back because they realize what you see today is not at all probably what you'll wind up with at the end of this process.
Jeannie, this is being framed as a change in U.S. policy, remembering the refrain in the Biden White House. We talked about it earlier, nothing for Ukraine without Ukraine. How do you see it?
Oh, it's absolutely a full-scale change in policy. I mean, it's a change in policy going back decades. I mean, let's not forget, Vladimir Putin has been in office for over 20 years. What has changed now is not only that we have Vladimir Putin as this tyrant invading sovereign countries, but you have a U.S. president who seems to be, by his rhetoric, condoning that behavior. Just a few minutes ago, and I think Kayleigh mentioned this earlier, just a few minutes ago when he's signing this EO, he is blaming Ukraine and Vladimir Zelenskiy, indicating that they're whining that they had 3 years to resolve this. Their country was invaded, and we joined NATO, we created NATO as a mutual deterrent, because there is a very real threat now. If the United States condones this behavior, what is to stop other autocrats around the world? What is to stop, for instance, Xi Jinping from saying, I, too, want to rewrite the lines of countries around the world. I shall just go into Taiwan and take it. The president has fully 360 degrees changed U.S. foreign policy. And a lot of heat is going to Hegseth and to J.D. Vance, but all of this has been condoned and driven by Donald Trump.
Okay, so if you're advising European leaders right now, Rick, what do you tell them about what they need to be bracing for realistically for all of their talk about cooperating and working with this administration?
Well, over the last 20 years, they've spent about 1% of their GDP on defense. They need to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. That is actually something they should have been doing all along. The CEO of Rheinmetall just excoriated the European governments. He's the largest defense contractor in Europe, and he said, you know what? You ought to quit whining and actually do something about this. So if you want to be a player in the defense of Europe, your backyard, then you better have a defense capability to do that. And by the way, they could easily fill the vacuum that's created by Donald Trump, getting out of Ukraine. They just announced a $6 billion package for defense of Ukraine. That could be $60 billion, which is what we've done in the United States. So I think that the Europeans have to actually look inward and say, we have to start owning, some responsibility, if not the majority of it, for the defense of Europe. And, they've had a great run with the U.S., but this president is not going to be the backstop for Europeans' lack of commitment to their own defense.
How about when it comes to economic partnership or development in Russia? That reference today from Marco Rubio got a lot of attention. The idea of potentially American companies going back into Russia, what does that look like if there is, in fact, a deal on Ukraine?
Yeah, these two things that happened today that I think everyone's trying to figure out, like, what does this mean, was a leaked concept around a three-point plan for the agreement, which would give U.S. 50% of the value of the rare earths as reparations for the money we've spent. No talk about Russians paying reparations for what they did. And then on top of that, this idea of, loosening up sanctions. I think we just heard earlier, no, we're not loosening up sanctions until after there's a peace treaty. And so, look, you would expect that in a post-war environment, there would be a process to sort of look at what Russia's role in the world's going to be. And I think this is what Russia hopes to get out of this deal, is some kind of rationalizing of their position in the world. They've been isolated for a long time. They want to get back in the world. And Donald Trump's just a guy who's going to open the door for them.
Well, and Jeannie, Donald Trump said today he's planning to meet with President Putin potentially by the end of the month. What would the optics of that look like?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. The fact is, a lot of it is going to depend on where they meet, how this comes together. It's been fascinating to watch Donald Trump thank Vladimir Putin rather profusely for the phone call, right? He goes out of his way. And so it almost feels in a way like Donald Trump is more of the aggressor and trying to reach out to Vladimir Putin. So this meeting, we'll have to see how it comes together. But, I think for many people, if you're a Ukrainian, for instance, and you're looking at what's happening in Saudi Arabia today, and you're seeing relatively new diplomats on the U.S. side meeting with seasoned Russian diplomats, and already has been laid out on the table that you will not get your land back. You will not be entering into NATO. Russia may come into the G8. I don't know how confident, if you're Ukrainian or if you're European, you would feel about this as negotiating. So, I agree completely with the professor. The idea is when the Trump team tries to sell this as, we're just meeting to size them up. This does not feel like that kind of negotiating to anybody in Europe or Ukraine. This feels like Donald Trump doing what Donald Trump does, a very real attempt to make a transactional deal with Russia. And there are arguments for that, by the way. John Mersheimer, among others, says confronting China means we need to get back in good graces with Russia. I don't know why Donald Trump is doing this, but if you're Ukraine or Europe, once again, you're not going to come to our mutual defense like you did after 9/11 if this is the way you are being treated. So there are very real repercussions for our security here at home.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, stay with us as we talk about, here at home, the latest efforts and lawsuits surrounding the Department of Government Efficiency. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
People are respecting us again as a country, and as a powerful country and maybe a smart country, but maybe not so smart, because when you look at some of the waste, fraud, and abuse that's being uncovered by DOGE and the people at DOGE, these are young, often young, but super brilliant people, incredible computer scientists and other things, and they're finding levels of fraud and waste and abuse like I think nobody ever thought possible.
That was President Trump weighing in on the Department of Government Efficiency in the last hour, as a federal judge in Washington today denied a bid to halt the DOGE and Elon Musk's access to government agency systems and ability to make decisions about policy, budgets, and personnel. Back with us for more is our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino. So, Jeannie, obviously we've had repeated conversations on this program about the courts acting as a check on the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk. But what if they don't or can't fully?
Yeah, I mean, so far, this is working the way it should in the United States. The administration or another injured party feels that something is not right. They go to court and you abide by the decision. And so in this case, the case you just mentioned, the decision goes the way of the president. I think the concern people have is the rhetoric coming out of the White House. Things like the president was saying this weekend that, you know, quoting supposedly Napoleon. Those kinds of things give people pause to assume that maybe if he gets a decision he doesn't like, he may not listen. But so far on that, so good. So it's working the way it should. I also would like Congress to step up every once in a while, but we haven't seen that happen either.
Rick, is privacy the line? We've heard from Republican members. Of course, Steve Bannon has his own take. Go ahead and fire whoever you want here. Save our money, but stay away from our personal information.
Yeah, I think that's a discussion, and certainly would be very Republican to say, you know, that the government should not be sharing that information with anybody. Yeah. It's segmented for a reason. But I don't think DOGE really cares about any of those comments. They've done very little in terms of briefing the Hill. As you can see, the Hill committees on DOGE are running behind them, not ahead of them. And so, look, I think that we're going to have some time to live with DOGE and realize that they're getting access to everything they've asked for. They have a presidential mandate to do it, and it's going to be very hard for any agency to resist them, because what happens if you resist, you get fired or you resign. And so right now, I think there's an unlimited amount of power that DOGE is wielding in Washington. And it's not all within the confines of the rules and regulations and laws that govern government agencies. And so one I'm watching right now is the appeal to the courts, as Jeannie says, on the Office of Legal Counsel, an independent agency with a 5-year term. They want to get rid of the head of that, and it's going to the Supreme Court likely within a few weeks. So at this stage, that could be the test for independent agencies.
Fascinating. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shan Zaino, thank you so much on what feels like the Monday edition. It's the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Coming up, a look ahead to what we can expect tomorrow in Washington, right here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew as we round out this Tuesday edition and look ahead to Wednesday, a day that will feature a speech by President Trump at the Future Investment Initiative Institute down in Florida. He is scheduled to speak for an hour. In fact, at this time, 5 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be bringing it to you live on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. But while this is a conference about investment, we could perhaps hear him talk about foreign direct investment into the United States, which he obviously has been trying to attract. When you have an hour-long speech by Donald Trump, there is no telling what all.
Yeah, I'm not sure we should focus too much on specific issues for what could be the weave here. Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, of course, running this event, and the dots are not too difficult to connect to Saudi Arabia. It was floated, of course, as a meeting place for both President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and it's the very spot where those Ukraine talks opened this morning, knowing that the administration wants to be closer to Riyadh and sees a great opportunity there. But he's going to be in Miami. We're talking crypto, right?
Well, we very well could.
Absolutely.
It could work its way into his remarks. But yeah, you're exactly right. Foreign policy and geopolitics likely to feature heavily in not just the president's remarks, but in the other discussions, investment-oriented discussions that will be taking place over the course of the conference. It lasts until Friday, February 21st. Bloomberg will have live coverage on the ground of that. And again, we'll be bringing you the president in his own words at this time tomorrow.
That's right. Tyler Kendall's on a plane right now for our special coverage that we'll bring you from Miami tomorrow, including the president's speech. So check out the Washington Edition newsletter in the meantime. Find it on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you back for it tomorrow. Thanks for joining us and have a good evening. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.